Hi, and welcome to The Lowdown with me, Nick Cohen. Journalists love cliches, and among our favourite cliches is unprecedented. And if unprecedented won't do, we will say extraordinary, or we will say crisis. We will throw these huge dramatic words around in the vain hope, often vain hope, of grabbing your attention. But I think it's not just journalistic hyperbole to say that Britain faces a huge and unprecedented political crisis. In the past, the two main parties, one of them has always held together. So in the 1920s, the old Liberal Party, which dominated the opposition to the Conservatives in the 19th century, it split into different factions. The Labour Party hived off. Labour eventually became the opposition to the Tories. The Tories held together and they dominated Britain, as they so often had. In the 1980s, the Labour Party split between the party and the Social Democrats. The Tories held together, it held the right-wing vote, and it dominated Britain. Again, very much Britain's cost, in my view, because I was around at the time. Now, left and right are splitting. The Conservatives always dominated the right. There were tiny parties like the National Front and the BNP, neo-Nazi parties. But the Conservatives always dominated the right. Now, the right-wing vote is split, and Nigel Farage is the most popular politician in the country. Allegedly, if there's an election tomorrow, he might win. Meanwhile, you would have bloody thought, wouldn't you? You would have thought for the first time in history, the right wing is falling apart, it's splitting off. All the centre-left needs to do is to hold together. All it needs to do is just to stick together. It could dominate British politics for decades to come. But of course, anyone who's been around the left for 5 minutes knows the last thing the left can do is hold together, and it's splitting off in every which way. You can vote if you're in Scotland, and you're left wing, you can vote Labour or Scottish National Party or Green. In Britain, the Green Party is shooting up. It's got a charismatic new leader. There's talk of some kind of Corbyn radical left party as well. The left vote is going every which way. All of this under a first past the post system which cannot begin to handle multi-party democracy. We've never seen anything like it before, or have we? I'm joined today by one of the most interesting writers on British politics and British political history, Robert Saunders. He is Deputy Director of the Mile End Institute, reader in modern history at, I think, Queen Mary's. He has published loads of books. Yes to Europe, about those days in the 1970s when the Tory party and the Tory press were begging us to go into the EU, led by Margaret Thatcher. He's written about Margaret Thatcher's Britain as well. He's won all kinds of awards. Everyone reads him. Everyone listens to him. Robert, welcome to The Lowdown. How are you?
I'm all the better for that introduction. Thank you very much.
I mean, am I just being a journalist running around like a chicken with his head cut off, or are we really in extraordinary times?
I think we probably have to distinguish between what is unprecedented and what isn't. So if we were having this conversation in something like October 1981, so not that much further into Margaret Thatcher's government than we are currently into Keir Starmer's government, we would be looking at the polls and we would find the Conservative Party on 29%, Labour on 28%, and a new insurgent force, the SDP Liberal Alliance, on 40%. If we then had that conversation again in December, we'd find the Conservatives and Labour tied on 23% and the Alliance on 50%, which is almost double what Reform is currently polling. So the scenario in which a governing party seems to be failing, but the opposition party is also in crisis and some new force is hoovering up support in the polls, that isn't particularly new. I'm sure you'll remember David Steele of the Liberal Party telling the Liberal Conference in 1981 to go back to your constituencies and prepare for government.
I am so old, Robert, so very, very old. I do remember it.
Right.
And I remember that poll as well.
And that was not a crazy thing to say in that particular moment. Now, we know how that story ends. We don't know how our story ends. If we're looking for differences between then and now, I guess the main difference is that in 1981, there was one insurgent challenger. And so if that challenger began to fall away, the likelihood was that at least one of the big two would revive in consequence. And that's ultimately what happens. Whereas today we're in a scenario where there are 5 parties in England, all of which are polling within about 10% of each other. In fact, there are four parties within about 4 or 5%. And that's before we talk about the independents. That's before we get some kind of Corbyn-Sultana party. That's not talking about Plaid Cymru in Wales or the SNP in Scotland. We've never had that kind of fracturing before. And if that continues through to a general election, then first past the post is going to go completely haywire. And we have absolutely no idea where we're going to find ourselves.
Do you understand, as a historian, if you're looking at bigger trends, the the fate of the Labour Party strikes me as really important because you go on about it now being hugely unpopular in government. Well, okay, it's had a terrible inheritance. Um, it's got to do nasty stuff. It's not surprised unpopular, but it barely won a third of the vote in the 2024 election. It's the first past the post system you described going haywire. If I'm a right winger, I would say first past the post goes haywire in 2024. Labour get two-thirds of the 2/3, forgive me, of the seats on 1/3 of the vote, which is not just by anyone's sense. Park that for a moment. Do you understand why Labour, even then, is historically plumbing new depths of unpopularity?
So I think there's probably a long-term story here and a short-term story. And the long-term story, which doesn't get enough attention, is about the long decline of the two-party system actually over the last 60, 70 years. So in 1951, Labour and the Conservatives between them hoovered up 97% of the vote. 97%. Almost everybody who went out to vote voted for one of those two. By the time we get to 2010, never mind where we are today, that's dropped by a third. It's gone down to 65%. But the real drop is actually much bigger because if you count people who are not voting at all and are simply staying at home, then the share of the electorate that actually goes out and votes for one of the big two parties halves over that period. It goes from more than 80% to barely 40%. So there was this kind of iceberg slowly melting over that period. Now, because of the implosion of the Lib Dems in 2015 and because of Brexit, that actually temporarily went into reverse in 2017 and 2019. But I think those are anomalous elections, and to some extent, 2024 is a continuation of that longer pattern.
Why do you think that pattern has been set in place?
Well, in some ways, having a two-party system in a very diverse political culture with tens of millions of people with different interests and different ideas is itself quite odd. That's not the natural state of politics. It was there, I think, and it flourished because for much of the 20th century, those two parties had really deep social roots. They were social organisms, not just political parties. So the Labour Party was built around a trade union movement that could mobilize tens of millions of people, that was part of their working lives, that was part of their class identity. Or if you looked at the Conservative Party, this was a party that was rooted in things like the Church of England, the Rotary clubs, the mothers' unions. Conservative clubs were serious social organizations where you would go for a good night out. The Young Conservatives were the kind of 1960s equivalent of Tinder. It's where people went to find
Oh,
a husband
absolutely.
or a
Yes,
wife.
absolutely.
Right, and that whole world has completely disintegrated for reasons that, aren't necessarily the party's fault. That sort of voluntaristic society doesn't really exist anymore. So people don't have that kind of deep social attachment to a party identity. It's much more simply an expression of political preferences. And so it might be that in a way we're going actually back to a more natural situation in which there's a much wider variety of options available to us that we move between.
So you don't think there's anything horribly wrong or foolish that Keir Starmer has done and the Labour Party has done that has alienated? I mean, it's alienating the type of people who might well be your students, Robert. It's alienating the leftish, progressive, middle class who are absolutely spinning away from it, are spinning off to Polanski, who voting Plaid Cymru in Wales, who possibly even see the Liberal Democrats now as more left wing than Labour. Has the Labour Party just fundamentally misread the nature of the country it's governing?
Oh, I think it's completely possible and compatible with what I've just said to say that Labour is playing the hand in front of it extremely badly. But I think we do have to recognise that it's also inhabiting a different environment to the one that perhaps you and I are used to when we think of party politics. It's not an accident that the Conservative Party also has its worst ever election result in 2024. Even Reform UK, which we talk about as if it's some unstoppable world power in politics, is bumping around somewhere between about 25 and 27% of the votes. So I think it is important to say that it's just really difficult for any party at the moment to build a really large and broad electoral coalition.
Yeah, but Labour seems to. I mean, God knows, I've been like this at times in my writing. It's very easy if you're Labourist to get into a kind of prolulin now contempt for the educated middle class. I mean, it is so easy. It really is easy. I mean, often, looking at some of the fads that sweep progressive middle class opinion, contempt is not necessarily the wrong emotion, but it seems to actually really dislike. It's pulling itself up now, but it seems to almost dislike the people who vote for it. It's you listen to what comes out of Downing Street, or allegedly comes out of Downing Street from Morgan McSweeney, and you think they are like you. They are remembering a 20th century of that trade union Labour vote, and they're trying to appeal to it. I mean, particularly, all they've done is alienate people who actually do vote for them, and absolutely paint themselves into a corner on the EU, which they had no need to do, on tax. You see, and again, the Labour Party doesn't quite realise this in the 21st century either.
Yeah, and I think the point you made earlier about Labour only winning a third of the vote in 2024 is really important. And indeed, I think we can go a bit further and say if we count non-electors and we look at turnout, only 1/3 of the total electorate voted for either of the traditional big two parties. So we do have a really big problem here. And one difficulty, I think, is that for a long time, first past the post disguised this problem. The iceberg was melting, but it wasn't really making any difference to the outcomes of elections in the sense that you could still win very big majorities on small shares of the vote. And Labour in 2024, in some ways, did what was strategically sensible. You don't get rewarded under first past the post for piling up large numbers of votes or for your vote share. You get rewarded for the efficiency of your vote. And Labour was absolutely laser targeted on winning votes where it thought that it needed to. And it was actively shutting constituency parties out of its campaigning software if it thought the seat was already safe or if it thought that the seat wasn't competitive at all. And in its own way, that was brilliantly successful, but it's a very dangerous strategy because it means that the party hasn't been thinking for quite a long time about how it wins and then holds together a large electoral coalition. It left itself absolutely no margin for the loss of support that was almost inevitable in the conditions in which it was governing. And I think you're absolutely right to say that Labour seems to be utterly obsessed with a particular idea of the Labour voter, a particular idea of the working class, which is old, male, white, probably retired, and deeply socially conservative. And actually, its electoral base hasn't looked like that for quite a long time. And indeed, the working class doesn't look very like that if you're actually talking about the people who are in work and often in low paid or manual work.
Yeah, I mean, I find it fascinating. Is a polite way of putting it, Robert. I find it in a way it's malign. When you read Telegraph writers who went to some of the best public schools this country can offer, writing about the working class and saying they're speaking for the working class, they have no idea who the working class is. I don't just mean they don't live in working class districts. I mean they think the working class is white. Working class has become a synonym for white. Actually, the working class go into any hospital, go into any cafe. It's multiracial. It's multiracial now, and that's incidentally, I think, why the Conservatives may be running some problems as they get more and more blood and soil nationalists. But leave that aside. In your analysis, which is all I agree with entirely, I notice you make no room at all for big factors shaping British history, economic factors, like the crash of 2008, which I think I don't think we've ever really recovered from that. If you certainly look at the now famous graph of how real wages increase, there's a straight line going up from the Industrial Revolution onwards, from the 1750s onwards. Real wages of British workers increase every generation until you get to 2008, and then it just stops. The increase stops. We become a stagnant economy. Brexit makes it worse. Do you factor any of that into your explanation of what's happening in British politics, or is it more a consumerist, capitalist explanation? We are highly diverse people. We're used to choice in Tesco. Why the hell shouldn't we have choice in the ballot box?
Oh, I would absolutely want to include those structural forces. I think there are all sorts of big structural challenges confronting British politics, which neither of the main parties really knows what to do with. So we have, in a sense, a political generation that came to political maturity in the 1990s, which in lots of respects was a very odd decade, in which the Cold War was over. You didn't really have to think about geopolitical conflict, which meant that, for example, defense spending could drop dramatically. You were also operating in a historically extremely unusual period of continuous growth, which meant that you had more and more money for public services without having to raise taxes. Indeed, you could cut taxes and you would still have an increasingly thriving public sector. We live in a completely different world now, and our politics hasn't adjusted to that. So geopolitical conflict is back, which means that actually we are going to have to think really seriously about how we fund defense. A sort of geopolitical economic conflict is back, in which things like trade blocs are really going to matter, and we've just left the one that we used to belong to. We have an aging society, which transforms the pressures on the public finances and is radically transforming our tax base. We don't talk enough about the impact of things like climate change already on our politics, both in terms of things like energy costs, Britain's position in the kind of energy ecology, and the way that that drives things like immigration, which is bending our politics into new shapes. None of those issues, I think it was very striking that in the 2024 election, I don't think we talked about any of those things in any serious depth. So we have a politics that isn't actually talking about the big structural challenges that are in front of it.
Whose fault is that? Do you have, as I do, a kind of liberal intellectuals fantasy, sort of West Wing fantasy, where some kind of Bartlett type leader could emerge and talk about the big issues and lay them out to the public and be greeted with thunderous applause? Or, gosh, who was it who said that? Who was it said that? It was an old head of the European Commission once said, look, everyone in politics knows what the problems are and knows what needs to be done to fix them. Jean-Claude Juncker, that's who it was. He said, we know what needs to be done to fix them. What we don't know is how on earth we get elected once we've done that. Do you think it's the politicians are being small, or the media is making them small, or that people know but are too frightened to even discuss the challenges we face?
I think, again, we've got a mix of things. So when we say that the politicians are small, on one level, I think that's both true and untrue. I don't think our politicians today are any less talented than they've been for most of the last 100 years. There are plenty of very interesting and thoughtful people with the right kind of motives in Parliament. What our current political class is astoundingly and dangerously inexperienced. So if we take somebody like Rishi Sunak, clearly a talented man, he went from being a brand new backbencher to a former prime minister in 9 years. That was the totality of his political career. By that stage in Margaret Thatcher's career, I think she was shadow transport spokesperson. You had, much longer and much slower political careers in which you had a bit more time actually to learn your trade, work out what you thought, experience a wide range of political conditions. And I think that was important. It's not that Margaret Thatcher was kind of transcendently more gifted than the politicians today, or that Harold Wilson was, but that they had a wider range of experience in which to draw. And they also had to think about politics across the longer term. The assumption was that you moved between government and opposition. And I think that imposed some kind of constraining power on politicians too. So I think that in a way is another structural change, which we sometimes miscast as being about the intrinsic quality of our politicians.
I guess to back up your argument, Robert, Keir Starmer enters the Commons in 2015, I think, is Prime Minister by 2024. Again, far
Exactly.
too fast.
And there's a sort of hoary cliche that people often pull out that what we need in politics is more people from outside politics with other kinds of experience. Well, we've got that with Keir Starmer. We've
Mm.
got a man who had a very distinguished career outside politics and then came to politics late on, and it's not working brilliantly. That actually political experience itself is really valuable, and we don't have much of it in our system at all.
Yeah.
And that's partly why when people talk about what would happen if Keir Starmer fell under a bus, or what is the case for replacing Keir Starmer, it's quite difficult to come up with a range of compelling alternatives
Yeah.
because you're also looking at, quite talented and interesting people who have been in politics for about 5 minutes.
Mm. No, I reread recently Max Weber's essay, Politics is a Profession, and I didn't realize until I read it that, partly because I guess get so annoyed by this populist drivel that you hate professional politicians. No, no, no. Politics is a skill. You have to learn it. It's a trade. It's a trade like any other. And he was writing, Weber wrote that famous essay in 1919, the most terrible circumstances for Germany. It had been defeated in the First World War. There was hunger. There were freebooters who were to become the Nazis, roaming the streets, killing people. There were communists trying to kill people and set up communist states in Bavaria. And he's saying you absolutely need professional politicians who can guide a country away from these disasters. And it is a real skill. It's not something it's not something you can just say, oh, you know what, I'll make some money in business, be prime minister for a bit, then go off and work for some bank again, as what an awful lot of conservative politicians are doing. Or like some say, I can be a lawyer, I can be DPP, or be prime minister now. That'd be nice. Something to add to the CV. It's far more serious than that, politics.
Yes, what Max Weber was trying to explain in that essay, I suppose, was how was it that this tiny collection of islands off the coast of Europe had risen to such extraordinary global power to the
Britain.
extent that it was able to defeat Germany in a world war? Obviously, in both cases as part of wider alliances. And part of his explanation was that British politics was structurally designed to train, test, and improve leaders. And he particularly emphasized the role of the parliamentary system in that, in the sense that leaders had to kind of fight their way to success over a longer period of time. They had to
Mm.
prove that they could master a subject, that they could engage in political conflict, and that you had a very effective pipeline for leadership. I think it would be quite difficult to look at our political system today and say that this is a good pipeline for leadership. So,
Yeah.
we can talk about the evident weaknesses of Boris Johnson or Liz Truss or Keir Starmer, or we can actually ask why it is that our political system keeps putting people like that in power.
You are listening to The Lowdown with me, Nick Cohen. My guest today is Robert Saunders, author and academic and authority on British political history. Robert, can we? It really flows on from what you've just been saying, but as you've been emphasising before, the same problem applies to the Tories. They just flounder from leader to leader. In fact, they no longer seem to. You're talking about the strange death of Tory England, the death of Toryism in the army, in the church, in the clubs, in society. When we talk, conservatism was woven into society of bourgeois England. And bourgeois Britain, actually. You go to Scotland, you can still, in some towns, still see conservative clubs. They're a rare beast, but you can occasionally see them. That's gone. But conservatives never, they used to be, however much you dislike them, however awful and brutal they were, they say, you might hate us, you might absolutely hate us, but by God, we know how to govern. We know how to keep this country going. We know how to do the king's business. And from 2010 to 2024, they showed that they really didn't. Is that fair? Is that a reason for their falling apart? It's very hard if you're a conservative. If you're a conservative, to go back and say, at some point they're going to have to go and point. They're going to say, as Labour people did to the Blair Brown government, said, you know what, you might have disliked what we did on X or Y on Iraq or whatever. We did some really good stuff, and you can be really proud of that. It's very hard to see how a conservative does that about the government of 2010 to 2024. Has that failure doomed them, do you think?
Yes, I think it would be difficult to look across that period as a golden age of conservative government, even if you're a dyed-in-the-wool conservative. And I think something that should particularly worry them is that they went through quite a lot of different versions of conservatism in that period. So we had the David Cameron era, which was a sort of hugger-hoodie, fiscally conservative Thatcherism. We then had the Theresa May era, which was in a way a kind of return to a sort of 1950s conservatism, of sort of the village fete conservatism of somebody like Theresa May. We then have the kind of cakes and ale Toryism of Boris Johnson. We have whatever extraordinary weirdness Liz Truss represents, but perhaps some sort of misreading of the Gloriana phase of Margaret Thatcher's era. And then we end with Rishi Sunak going back to perhaps the kind of early 1980s small state Thatcherism. And none of those things worked. And that suggests again that there's something more fundamentally wrong with this party. And I absolutely think they made a lot of terrible decisions and tactical errors in that period. But I think we also do have to go back to this point about what has gone wrong structurally with the party. And this is a party that used to be anchored in all sorts of important institutions, that was very deeply rooted in the world of British business, that was connected to institutions like the Church of England, the armed forces, the kind of voluntarist culture. And that also meant it had a lot of kind of different sources of information and ideas flowing into it. It's either cut itself off from those things, or those things have essentially died. So it's become a kind of tree with no roots. And I don't think it's entirely surprising, therefore, that it crashed down in the way that it did in 2024.
Yeah. Well, better minds than mine have made the point that Brexit would never have happened if British capitalism still existed in its 20th century form. There would have been big capitalist bosses, so to speak, deeply tied to the Conservative Party, who said to Johnson, "Fuck off, Johnson, you cannot possibly do this. It's really stupid." But as capital is now multinational, you're running a world famous drugs company, and you've got plants in southern England, in Oxford, near Oxford or Cambridge. You can always move them. If the world gets bad, there isn't the national capitalism to keep the right-wing fantasies of the Conservative Party in check anymore. And the same applies elsewhere, I would say, as well. I mean, it's not, you haven't got, for all people mock the conservatism of the Women's Institute and what have you, they did care about poverty, for instance. They did care about the social problems facing Britain. You couldn't just be a horrible, vicious bastard and get past them. They would pull you up on that, and that's gone too. And it's, as you say, it's a tree without roots. Do you understand, Robert, why? First of all, do you think I'm exaggerating when I say they are going off to the far right, or elements of them are, like Genrick, like people who are trying to say that people have got absolute right to stay in this country, leave to remain, are legally here, should through retrospective legislation have their right to stay in Britain torn up? Do you understand why the right wing is getting so very right wing? Can you explain that?
I'm not sure I can explain it, but I do agree that there is a significant change going on. There have always been radical right movements and pressures in British politics across the 20th century. But for most of that period, the Conservative Party was able either to marginalise them, as with Mosley, or to absorb them. And it often did that actually in deeply unpleasant ways. And we shouldn't romanticize an older conservatism. I've been teaching this term a course on the 1980s, and this is a period in which the Conservative Party legislates to declare homosexuality a pretended family relationship, in
Yeah.
which Margaret Thatcher very consciously adopts a lot of the rhetoric of the National Front and talks about the culture of this country being swamped by people of different cultures. So we have to be careful not to kind of clean up the history of the
Oh no
Conservative
no no no
Party.
no no no! No one who was there in the 1980s would let you do that, Robert, even assuming you wanted to.
Absolutely, and I know that you're not doing that, but I do think what has shifted is a sense that the centre of gravity has moved. That the kind of great gravitational mass was the Conservative Party, which drew into its more elements of the radical right. Whereas it feels at the moment like the centre of gravity is with the radical right, and that the Conservative Party is being dragged towards it, and
Absolutely,
could conceivably be
absolutely.
absorbed by it.
Yeah. Well, you look at politicians like Genrick and others. Sorry, I can't remember all their names. They're so obscure now. The conservative leadership, um, and they seem to be out Faraging Farage. They seem to want to outflank him on the right to get the support of Elon Musk, which I don't think you can underestimate. Incidentally, if you're a practical politician, you're a practicing politician in an age where, as you say, there isn't mass membership. There aren't millions of people all paying their party fees, giving you money. There aren't British businesses handing you checks. You are essentially at the mercy of oligarchs hobbyists almost. So Elon Musk, the world's richest man, is kind of sitting there, and he's saying to the British extreme right, I am the world's richest man. There is money for you if you essentially embrace Tommy Robinson, or essentially go further than Farage and starts talking about deportation of perfectly legal, law-abiding citizens of this country. Um, that strikes me as a real force on the right. This is not being opposed. You can read the Tory press. There's nothing like, I worked on the Guardian, the Observer. There were real arguments about Corbyn and the far left. I mean, really, really hard arguments. But as is quite right, we're centre-left newspaper. That's where you have your arguments. There's no arguments at all in the right-wing press now about Farage, about the radical right, about deportation, about saying only white people can be English. It all passes without a cough or a splutter, and that adds more to your wonderful image of the radical right drawing in to the Tory party, the Telegraph, all the Mail, and the tiger they've tried to ride is eating them now.
Yes, I mean, when we were talking about the structural forces that are rewriting British politics, an obvious one that we didn't mention is the complete transformation of the information environment and the rise of social media. And I think it's clearly important that what we would once have called the mainstream right and the radical right now inhabit the same information space. They're all together on X. They're all responding to the same kinds of stimuli. And you can see in real time politicians like Robert Jenrick being radicalized on X. They're inhabiting the same space increasingly as Trumpian republicanism. And I think a challenge for both parties actually is they can't wish away these new forms of communication.
No.
They've got to find ways to use them in ways that don't just mimic the kinds of politics that we hope that they reject. They've got to find ways to do serious, difficult politics on social media. And that's something that neither of them are doing with any kind of success, or indeed, I would say, a great deal of effort at the moment.
Do you think it's possible, or do you think the medium is the message, and it's simply impossible in the new media of Twitter, of social media? Do you think, without getting all Marshall McLuhan on you this early in the morning, the media impose their own limits on what can be done, and society based on reading and on newspapers, on books, the politics you could have in that society is wholly different from the politics you can have on the society based, a media based on TikTok and Twitter.
I think as Democrats, we have to believe it's possible. Because otherwise, what's the point of being a Democrat at all if you don't think that you can actually have a productive conversation with the electorates in the conditions in which you actually live? But perhaps a more kind of tangible response to the question would be, this isn't the first time that we've had a new disruptive technology that's changed how politics is done. If we went back to the 1920s, which was in which we had genuine multi-party politics at general elections as opposed to kind of mid-term, that's also a period in which new technologies are emerging like radio and television and cinema, which politicians simply don't know how to use. But they go out and learn. The Conservative Party dedicates enormous amounts of energy and attention in the 1920s to learning how to use television, to learning how to broadcast well. These are technologies that actually wipe out the skill sets of a lot of politicians who were good at things like the platform and suddenly are standing on television sets with their hands on their lapels trying to deliver speeches. And again, actually, after 1945, we see a Conservative Party thinking about, right, the world has changed in all kinds of ways. How do we change with it? How do we find new forms of political messaging? And I think if you look at somebody like Zoran Mandami, who's been very much in the news recently, the newly elected mayor of New York, the test of government is yet to come. But I think what's interesting about him as a social media performer is that he does actually say quite complicated and complex things. But he does it in a way that's skillful and interesting and engaging.
Okay.
Even somebody like Donald Trump goes on podcasts and talks for 3 hours. It's not true that all the politics now is done in bite-sized chunks. If we compare that with what comes out of Labour's social media feed, which tends to be roughly along the lines of national renewal, we choose renewal over decline, party before country before party. I mean, it's just extraordinary.
I know. I mean, Raphael Bear, my colleague on The Guardian, who's a lot of sympathy for Starmer. Maybe he's an independent journalist, obviously he's not, but he just said he does feel like a man out of time. This is not his time anymore, and yes, you have to find ways to do it. And Kamala Harris famously was not prepared to just go on to a hostile interviewer's podcast and just talk for hours on end. Which just showed she wasn't really up to it. It's almost like the modern equivalent of, in the old days, back in the 1980s, which is now a course of study, good politicians would go on Brian Walden's interviews on London weekend television. I should remind people something. Brian Walden was this ferocious interviewer, but not ferocious in a kind of stupid, Today program kind of way. He was really well informed. There were teams of researchers researching all the hard questions, and the politician would be on for a long time. It wouldn't be like this ridiculous thing you have in the Laura Kunsberg program on Sunday when they have 4 or 5 guests. No, there'd be one guest, and by God, they had to be good. And the good politicians thought, yeah, I'll take on Walton any day of the week. I can beat him. I'm good enough. I've mastered my brief. Whereas Kamala, in some ways, the podcast is a bit like that today. Kamala Harris would not go on these big podcasts. She would not go on and she couldn't hack it in a new media environment. And as you say, that's not bite-sized idiocy, soundbite politics at all, is it? It's almost its opposite.
Yeah, and communications technologies are always changing in ways that render old skills redundant. I was doing a podcast recently about Neil Kinnock, and I think you could make the case that he was the last great platform orator of British politics. Being a great platform orator today doesn't carry any great political rewards with it. But in that world, you had to learn to do things like engage with hecklers, deal with hostile commentary. You had to think about how you communicated your speeches or selections of it to the press. And we've got a similar world today in which the long form is alive and well. Millions of people listen to podcasts. Millions of people will watch TikTok videos of people speaking, sometimes actually, in streams of videos for quite long periods of time. But you've got to find ways to take bits out of that and connect them to people in ways that are live and engaging, that aren't simply sort of ChatGPT generated slogans, which is what a lot of Labour and Conservative social media looks like.
It is odd. I mean, I guess I'm not expecting you to be able to answer this. It is odd that the Labour Party is the party that got the youth vote, that has access to all kinds of hip young people in Soho studios and all the rest of it. The Labour Party can't do this at all. I mean, it's really strange. You'd think they would have the media talent on tap to be a modern political movement.
Yes, and it's easy to blame this on Starmer, and it's clearly not Starmer's skill set. And I think also it's not what he thinks politics should be. I think that Starmer feels that this kind of communications, this kind of fluff, as he might regard it, is a distraction from the business of governing, rather than actually essential to the business of making your case to the public, speaking out against the things that you object to, giving a kind of moral leadership. But that's not going to change. So the question really is, where are the other people in the Labour Party who might be able to do that? He doesn't actually have to do it himself, but where are the outriders who might be more skilled at doing this than he is?
You are listening to, sorry, and you're that again. You are listening to The Lowdown with me, Nick Cohen. Our guest this week is Robert Saunders, academic, author, and authority on modern British politics and the British Constitution. Robert, can we just turn finally to Farage? Actually, do the Greens as well. Let's just talk about. Do you understand? If you had to give a simple explanation beyond consumer choice to why radical movements of the right and left are doing so well? You look at Farage, you could say you gave a very apt summary of the Conservative years of 2010 to 2024 about how it'd been failure after failure. But there's no coming to terms with that failure on the right anywhere I can see. For example, austerity, Cameron and Osborne, fails. It does not revive the British economy. All it does is weaken public services. You then have nationalism unleashed with Brexit. Complete disaster by every measure. Sold with a pack of lies. You have then Liz Truss reviving kind of Reaganite, not Thatcherite, supply side economics, which were fool's dream the first time round and a fool's dream the second time round. The first time was fast, the second time was fast, contrary to Marx. And all these things have failed massively, but you do not get anywhere on the right significant people holding up their hands saying, you know what, Brexit, real mistake. We've got to act in the best interest of the country now and see what we can salvage from the wreckage. I support us rejoining the customs union or whatever. Nothing like that. You don't get people saying we need to rethink our insistence on the Laffer curve and cutting taxes will inevitably boost growth because both Osborne and Truss in their different ways prove that wrong. There's no coming to terms with it. On the contrary, they're just going further to the right. They're doubling down.
I wrote an article just after the election in which I argued that the biggest danger for the Conservative Party was that they took refuge in comfortable myths about their defeat. And I think that's what they've been doing. It's extraordinary how often what one hears is that they were too left-wing, or that they were too absorbed by the blob, or that the blob resisted them in some way, that it's somebody else's fault. And I think they would be much wiser, actually, to look at what the Conservative Party did after 1945. 1945, the Conservative Party suffered one of the biggest defeats in its history, under one of the most popular leaders in its history. There was a widespread sense that something fundamental had changed in British culture because of the Second World War, that they were now confronting the first ever Labour majority government. And their response to that actually was to spend the next 5 years doing some really serious thinking. Under Rab Butler in particular, the Conservative Political Centre became a really intellectually dynamic organisation. They had policy reviews on everything. They had a new industrial charter. They had a series of sort of summer schools and educational projects that was all about thinking what had the Conservative Party got wrong in the 1930s? What did it need to do differently in the future? And the result of that is they're back in power in 6 years' time. And they're the dominant party again for most of the rest of the 20th century. There is nothing like that happening on the right at the moment, as far as I can see. And I think that's exceptionally dangerous, particularly for the Conservative Party, because the Conservative Party does, I think, aspire to govern. And it aspires to govern well. And if it doesn't think about why its attempts to govern have failed, then it could conceivably return to power. But it's not going to be better placed, actually, to do the things that it wants to do in power.
Do you think it's conceivable that Nigel Farage could come to power?
I think everything is conceivable. I think it would be, given what we've seen in British politics for the last 15 years, anybody who opines on what is and isn't politically possible needs their head examined. I don't think it's the most likely outcome, but it's entirely plausible if we continue to have the kind of political fragmentation we've got at the moment. We know, because it happened in 2024, that our electoral system can give very large majorities on quite low shares of the vote. So, yes, it's entirely possible that Nigel Farage is Prime Minister in 2029.
Okay, Robert, one final question. Suppose, as may well happen to you, a publisher comes to you and offers you a big advance, serious money, we're talking here, Robert, life-changing money. And he says, we want you to do the big book, the equivalent of The Strange Death of Liberal England for the early 20th century on. What the hell happened to Britain? How, from the era of Tony Blair, where everything seemed so stable and so simple and history was over, and as you were saying, neoliberal economics seemed to work. What on earth went wrong and how Britain went crazy? What would be the big things you would look at? What would be your themes, your chapter headings?
Nobody has ever offered me an enormous advance for a book, so
It will happen, Robert. Trust me, it will happen. I believe in you.
it would take me some time to recover from that. I think I would probably start it in 1990, actually. I think 1990 is a neglected dividing line in British history. We take for granted it's a dividing line in European history as the end of the Cold War. We don't talk enough, actually, about how that changes British politics. So, firstly, it has a deeply destabilizing effect on the Conservative Party, because the Conservative Party has always been an alliance of Conservatives and Jacobins and other groups. But what holds it together throughout the Cold War period is its hostility to socialism, the sense that there is this unifying enemy that you can organize against. And that's the kind of magnetic force that holds this alliance together. And once that's gone, the Conservative Party loses its coherence. And I think that's been, in a sense, the story of conservatism ever since. It also, as we discussed earlier, gives Britain this 10-year period of politics that is deeply anomalous, but which many of its politicians come to regard as normal. a period in which you can have high levels of spending on public services without high taxation, in which you're not thinking seriously about geopolitical competition or indeed about international trade and trade competition. Lots of the big questions of politics seems to be solved. So politicians have stopped thinking about that. So that means that when you encounter, in lots of ways, the much rougher and bloodier world of the 21st century, with the war on terror, the great financial crisis, the rise of China, those things seem to be anomalies. There's a kind of constant attempt to restore a model of politics that actually was always weird and peculiar. So I guess, in a way, what I would be organizing the book around would be the kind of long tail of 1990, the death of an old form of politics and the struggle of some new form of politics to be born.
That's certainly a book I would read. If any publisher is out there listening, I would just get your checkbook and get down to the Mile End Academy and just see how many noughts you can fit into that little box. Robert, thank you so much for coming on. It's been a great pleasure talking to you.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
I should just say, for housekeeping, if you've enjoyed the show, please give us a nice rating on your app, on Apple or YouTube or whatever, or write a little review. It helps spread the word and helps the show get out. I need to thank Andy Hoskins, the producer who puts the show together. I need to thank you for listening. If you like my stuff, you could always read me on Substack. Google Nick Cohen Substack, writing from London. You'll find me. Thank you so much. And until next time, goodbye.